Hello everyone, Babelito here, talking to you from sunny old Santa Fe. Why am I here in Santa Fe, not Albuquerque? I don't know, ask Airbnb. Anyway, here I am with one of my favorite people in the world. I am so excited. I've known this person since 2007. We are old. And we have Shana Klein, who is talking to us from where?
So I'm in very chilly Cleveland. And by the way, we are old, but we're pretty good looking given our age. Like, I don't think people know how old or young we really are.
I think I tell people in the podcast how old I am because of my hair.
Oh, stop it.
Oh girl, I just started getting into essential oils. So like at night, I put rosemary oil. I
Oh
wake up
my
in the morning and I like drink some lemon oil. It's changing my life. But anyway,
So funny. I just really quickly started a skincare routine because I was like, oh man, like I feel like I'm so behind on like wrinkle creams. I've never used anything. So now I'm like all about trying to preserve whatever youthfulness I have left.
yes, I I feel exactly the same way. My conversation with my friends are now like, oh, what are you listening to? Or like, what podcasts are going on in your life? Or it's like, oh, so what creams are you using? Tell me a little bit
Right?
more about
What
those.
do
Tell me about those oils. Did I tell you about my back?
I
Yeah. Okay. Well, Shane and I went to the University of New Mexico. We went to grad school. I have the most fun memories because we took a class. I was in several classes, but one class on race and gender with our advisor, Kirsten Pi Buick. Kirsten, I know you're listening to this. Come to the podcast already before it ends. Come on.
Yeah,
Um,
seriously.
and I just remember you and I will sit in a corner. We will complain about the readings. We'll be like, did you finish the readings? And I didn't want to admit, I think I only admitted it to you. I will be like, no, like that's so, like, it's like three fucking hundred pages. Like, I'm not gonna do this. And you're like, okay, me neither. So like, I always felt good, but fast forward many years and now you have your book. So amazing. Congratulations. We'll talk about the book, but I want you to introduce yourself, where you at, where you teach, everything that you do.
Yeah, so I just published this book called The Fruits of Empire. It came out of my dissertation from the University of New Mexico. And since then, I've had a number of fellowships. I have landed in an assistant professor position at Kent State University outside of Cleveland. And I hope that when you read this book, Emma, it reminded you of UNM because I really feel like this manuscript is actually like a love letter to our program at the University of New Mexico, like to all of the coursework in Central American art history that the late David Craven taught us, to our mama bear, Kirsten Buick, who's like pioneering in the field of African American art. And, even to those really special classes that we had with Aaron Fry, who, I don't know if you remember this, he took us to his home, right?
I
We're
was I,
class.
that day I was so stupid. I was asked to volunteer in Marfa, and because back then, like I was
No.
drinking the Kool-Aid, I'm like, I'm gonna go to
Oh,
Marfa
I
and
remember that. You were
volunteer.
so into that.
Yes. I was all about that minimalist art, baby.
Oh, well, I don't want to give you FOMO, but it was like the most meaningful experience. He took us to his home on the Laguna Pueblo and he like took us to the church and he had like a talk with the priest on the site. It was like my first real contact with like a Native American reservation. And he was just like so open about it. And it's these kinds of experiences that I feel like made our program so special. Like I am so proud to come from UNM as opposed to some of my peers who come from like the Ivy Leagues or the brand name institutions. Like they don't have the kind of knowledge and coursework that we had.
Right. And actually, I just took a seminar on how to go up the ethics of being in a search committee, right? And as part of the ethics, and I don't know how of a official rule this is, they tell you that in order to avoid class discrimination, you shouldn't consider somebody specifically from the program they come from, because this country is infamous. The university system of this country is infamous for choosing people from the program they come from as opposed to the actual individual and what they have to teach. So I feel like after this summer, slowly things are changing, and now people like they appreciate a lot at the University of New Mexico, where before, if we were to go against somebody from Harvard or Yale, like no chance, no
No
chance.
chance, right? Like, I think it's so great that we're from kind of like a West Coast school where we had this really rigorous curriculum in both everything inside the canon, and then our professors telling us to explode that canon, right?
Oh
Or to
my God.
or like invent new canons, like a lot of my peers didn't have that kind of education. And so they're like really behind when it comes to the current cultural climate. Like they're just starting to realize like, oh, I have like an internal bias, or, oh, I've been teaching European art. Like they haven't been thinking about this for years like we have. And that's not to say that I don't still constantly make mistakes, or that, I have blunders, and that I'm like, so woke. Like I hate that word woke even, but I think that we're just really lucky that we had such a unique education.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's so interesting because when I go present in art history conferences, I bring some of the ideas that we've been talking about for what, 13 years, 14
Yeah.
years? And people are like, what was that? It's just like, oh, that was Kirsten.
What?
Speaking
There's
from me.
Baroque in Mexico? What?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So before we continue, before we get into the book, what have you been eating? Like what, either like tell me what you ate today. Okay, no, let's do this. Tell me what you ate today, but also like maybe like a special meal that you've been doing at home during quarantining. I don't know. Like, go ahead.
So my answer is really embarrassing. I feel like because people think of me as a food studies scholar and an art historian who's like always thinking about food and contemplating it, I should be this great cook or baker in the kitchen. And I'm so not. Like I actually have the palate of a 5-year-old. I live the plainest, most straightforward foods. Like before we talked, I had slices of apple with peanut butter. Like that's how rudimentary things
Amen.
are. So
You gotta get that protein somehow.
exactly. I can't claim any sort of sophistication in the kitchen, but since doing research on food, I feel like my choices have become more ethical. Like I try to buy organic when I can, even though a lot of organic food is still produced by like Dole and Chiquita and like a lot of these problematic corporations. And I definitely still don't eat a ton of meat, just like thinking about how meat is produced in this country. And that I don't place any judgment on people who do. Like I'm not preachy about it. I'm not trying to like be evangelical about it, but I definitely think more consciously about what I'm eating. And it's also easy for me because what I eat is like kindergarten food. So here we're at.
Speaking of Kirsten, she always said that she's like, I have the palate of a 12-year-old, but she cooks some mean Asian food. She just made us some Chinese food.
I
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
know.
yeah.
Before she got off Instagram, she was like photographing her food. And then what really made me jealous is, don't you guys every year go to Puebla, or where do you go?
Yes, with Puebla, yeah.
Yeah, you guys would like photograph your food, post it on social media, and I would just be like torn apart at home, dying to eat what you're eating. Like that food looks so amazing.
I was that hipster that every time I went out of town, like I picture all of my food. That was actually one of the few things I miss of social media, because I will eat something and I will be like, this is so beautiful. Even today, like I just made like a romantic dinner, for my
Ooh,
hubby, and
okay.
I made lamb, which I haven't made in maybe 10 years.
Wow.
And it looks so good and it tasted so good. And I
Yeah.
keep taking those pictures, but they're just for my camera. So you best believe that my camera is filled with landscape pictures and
Yeah,
food
right.
pictures. It's so sad.
Well, I think about that a lot. Like, what is it in the 21st century that we suddenly want to photograph our food? Like, that really wasn't a trend
Mm.
until the rise of social media, the rise of the selfie. Like, there's something about photographing our food that it's not for ourselves, right? It's for other people. And so, what is that impulse, and like, when did it originate?
Yes, yes. Okay, let's get into that. But before we get into that, let's talk about, oh my God, I feel like this is, your family's gonna come back and we are just like in the
Don't worry
middle of
about
the conversation. Okay. So here I have your book, The Fruits of Empire, Art, Food, and the Politics of Race in the Age of American Expansion. Woo!
it. Yeah, it's a mouthful.
This is an amazing book. Like there's so many themes that you touch upon that I want to get into, but of course we don't have time. But uh, ideas of how the history of the production of food in this country, how it embraces and disavows new territories, peoples, of how the expansion of the United States, it's always contingent to like a visual culture of some sort. And the history of the production of food, it's no exception. So how do you attach a group of people that have not been part of the country? It is through promotion of food, et cetera, and the consumption of food and the production of it, and images. Food promotes stereotypes. Food promotes the creation, again, of the nation.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk to you about how food is throughout history has become part of its protest. But I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
But before those questions, I want you to tell me a little bit more about not only the book, but how you structure it, because it was very specific how you structured the different chapters of the book.
Yeah, so it's loosely chronological, but really it's divided by specific fruits. So I have
Mhm.
chapters. One is on the grape, the orange, the watermelon, the banana, and the pineapple. And I felt like as I continued to inventory all of these representations of food from the late 19th and the early 20th century, a lot of these fruits kept coming up again and again. And these were the fruits that seemed to be some of the most political foods, the ones that seemed to be the most racially charged, politically loaded, and ones that I couldn't ignore. And so it made most sense to structure the book around each individual fruit history and how it's represented in art and beyond, and like cookbooks and trade cards and photographs. It's really like a material culture study of food, more so than just like the capital A art, painting and sculpture.
Right. Why the grape?
Yeah, why the grape? The grape is actually the most frequent fruit in still life representations that I found. Like
Mhm.
Americans were obsessed with grapes. They were always depicting them in still life paintings and beyond. And the grape was really rooted in a history of European cultural supremacy, that Americans wanted to elevate themselves to the ranks of Italy and Germany and France, these grape growing empires. And so by depicting grape culture in America, they were trying to insert themselves as these authorities of taste and sophistication. And so the grape was like really this food that could establish status for American artists.
Are there any Catholic? I mean, it's a Protestant country, but are there any like Christian iconography in relation
Yeah.
to the fruit in how it migrates to the United States? And just to give our audiences some sort of context, we're talking about 18th century or so, no?
We're talking about like 19th century, yeah, like the 1800s, early 1900s, right around the time when like what we know of today as Napa Valley is coming to be. And so I look at the California grape,
Mhm.
and it's like loaded in Christian iconography, especially because so many of the paintings of California grape harken back to this nostalgic idea of Spanish California with
Mm.
missionaries coming in. And of course, what those images don't tell you is how they're relying on enslaved indigenous people, stealing land from indigenous people and from also Mexican landowners, and just like the sheer history of violence that is totally written outside the picture plane of this like romantic idea of the Spanish California grape.
We just had an interview with an author who talks about the history of El Zorro, and how the history of El Zorro, in a way, it's like it's the history of a renegade, like Robin Hood type of figure from Mexico, perhaps from somewhere else, because it's kind of like a mystery. But how in the early 20th century, the nostalgia of anything Spanish related to California and Hollywood, the Spanishization, if you want to call it, of California, renders the architecture, the movie industry into this like Spanish. And by Spanish, I mean the country, Spanish paradise.
Right.
But I never thought about the food, because the food is complementary to that. To this day, you go to the missions that were constructed in the 18th century in California, and each mission claims that they have the first like grape orchard.
Right, totally. Yeah, so actually that's how meaningful grapes were. Like Junipero Serra, the ultimate conqueror, he comes to California, and one of the first things he does is installs vineyards next to these California mission churches, right? So that cultivating the land and creating vineyards on the land was a way of claiming that landscape. It was a way of stealing that land, changing it, modifying it, dominating nature, and was really this device for political power. And at the same time that like Spanish California becomes so romanticized and whitewashed in Hollywood, remember there's also like a ton of racism against Spanish descendants. And so it's just this mixed bag of, you know, racial hostilities.
You know, it's interesting that you talk about the grape, because the mission system in California was created inspired by the mission system in Mexico in the 16th century, because the 16th century mission system of the Franciscans was considered the golden age, right, of the mission system. So the later missions constructed in Arizona, Texas, et cetera, they look back into the 16th century, and those Franciscans in Mexico were bringing Mediterranean plants, right, from Spain to create this idea of Jerusalem, because that was the idea, the second coming of Christ, and then they were going to construct the new Jerusalem. So I wondered if there's anything of that when it comes to California in the 18th and 19th century. And it seems like maybe the introduction to the grape has a little bit to do of creating a Mediterranean, and it's a little bit of a Mediterranean weather, but a Mediterranean environment, landscape, you know, through the food.
You know, I hadn't really considered that. So this might be an unsatisfying answer because I like don't know too much about that history. But in terms of the California grape, it definitely has to do with California seeing itself as the American Mediterranean. I mean, this is the grape that they use, the American Italy, the American Mediterranean. And I hope that part of this book will inspire scholars to look at grape culture in New Mexico, in Texas, around the time period of colonization and later, because there's like so much history to be done here. And visual representations of the fruit were just as ubiquitous and just as pervasive as discussions about the fruit itself. So visual images are such an important part of analyzing this history, and it needs to go way beyond California.
Right, and also the culture of wine consumption, right? That it's attached to class.
Totally. Yeah. And so like even as late as the 1970s, there was this huge competition in which California wines won over French wines. And like everyone was so upset because France is supposed to be the leader in wine. And here comes California unseating France in this competition. And it's just so loaded, right? We think of wine consumption as being part of like the elite classes. And so that's definitely rooted in earlier 19th century belief systems too.
Oh my God, have you seen that movie, A Walk in the Clouds? I just thought of it.
No, I'm going to write that down.
A Walk in the Clouds, it's a movie by, I think it's Alfonso Cuarón.
Okay.
One Mexican filmmaker, but it's with Johnny Depp and some Chicanos. I don't remember. Right. I'm so bad. Like I should be crucified because I know the name of the white actor, but not the Chicano actors. But it's about a family, like a California family that have had this orchard for a long time. But there's like a love story and like it's ridiculous. But it's all about the grape.
Okay, I gotta look that up.
Okay, so we have grape, bananas. Let's talk about bananas.
Yeah, the banana is really complicated. The banana is what actually was the inspiration for this book that we learned about in our Central American art history class. That's where we were exposed to the artwork of Moises Barrios. He's a contemporary artist in Guatemala. I don't know if you remember studying him, but what he does is he goes around and paints the display windows of Banana Republic clothing stores in the United States to think about how to glamorize and romanticize Banana Republic, a word itself that is just like so racially loaded and prejudiced. And that this system has created so much political instability, environmental devastation. It has started wars. And so the banana is like one of our most political fruits that has created so much bloodshed over that fruit and the land in which it was grown. And so I look at the visual culture of the banana since the 1800s. And I also use that as an example of how important it is to study art and representations of fruit, because in the United States, the banana was not mainstream until like the early 1900s. And so oftentimes most people would encounter the banana in an image before they would have ever held one or tasted one. And so
Wow.
I'm always trying to advocate for more people to study the visual image just because it's like the point of contact for a lot of people and food.
Speaking of visual image, the cover of your book has a illustration, a painting that is a bunch of bananas, and then you have like it looks like U.S. war
Yeah,
jets like on
exactly.
top of it. Can you tell me a little bit more about the cover and the art?
Yeah, I love that cover. That too is by Moises Barrios. Like that's how important Barrios is to my project, because I can give you so many examples of how images of food are just racist and awful and terrible. But it is way more rewarding for me to show you examples of how artists were resisting those systems of oppression. And so Barrios is a great example because he shows how devastating banana histories have been in Central America and the Caribbean. And so he shows that handful of bananas with American fighter jets defending those bananas like they're landscapes to be protected and of US interest and to be profited from. And so his artwork really shows how we as Americans have historically been so entangled in land colonization and commercial conquest as it comes to the banana. And I'll just tell you for listeners who might not be familiar, I mean, the United Fruit Company, which made the banana mainstream for American consumers, they orchestrated a coup that was supported by the CIA in Central American countries like Guatemala. So like that just shows you how political the fruit is, that there were wars that have been fought over the importation of this fruit and controlling the places where the fruit is grown.
That's like earlier in the year when we had the storming of the Capitol by those white supremacists.
Right.
Somebody told me, somebody said like, this is not called a coup just because it's not like in a Latin American country or not
use
stable.
the word banana republic. Like a senator talked about, what has America become? We're not a banana republic. I mean,
wow.
This term, first of all, and second of all, I mean, it's a term that also is really insulting to Americans because they're the ones who were trying to intervene in Latin America in terrible ways in the first place,
And another aspect of this whole history is you talk about how the images are cues of where your diet may go, right? Because that's just the way that the empire is going. But also, like, I think my husband and I recently saw this thing about how there were all these kinds of bananas. Yes. And then the companies chose one specific easy to grow banana. Right. And now there's all this like problems with it where like we're not gonna be able to, speaking of, like I have one here. I eat like 2 bananas a day. And like that's gonna go a waste, but it's not. If I want to buy something like this, I don't know, in 15 years or something, like I'm gonna have to pay a lot of money for that.
Yeah, so let me be a bummer for a second. Because
no!
I know, I hate to break it to you. There is like a lot of hysteria around the fate of the banana. There have been articles and books written about it since the 2000s because our banana variety is, I think, asexual. And so it is hard to reproduce. And we've set up this monoculture in which we've relied and depended on this one variety of the banana. And so when it gets hit by a virus, it affects all its type. And so I don't know what the destiny of the banana is going to be. There's been a lot of hysteria over it for a while now, and nothing's really happened, it doesn't seem. So maybe we have reason to be optimistic. I'm not sure. But also to be a bummer, the banana that we eat today is a lot less delicious, apparently, than the banana that was eaten in the 1800s. Like I would love to eat the Gros Michel banana that Americans had. It was shorter, it was thicker, kind of pudgier, and it was supposed to be like so flavorful. So
you still can. I think you can order it, but it's gonna be like
I think $50. It comes from like India now. Yeah, I think it's hard to get for people in the United States, but I would pay big money to try a Gros Michel banana. Like that's where I want to spend my money.
Note to self, Christmas present,
yeah, right.
birthday present.
I mean, I welcome it.
Okay, so we've done grapes, bananas. I love how this is developing. Let's talk about the watermelon. The watermelon is probably in terms of our popular culture, the most visually charged
Yeah.
fruit. Tell us a little bit more about that history.
Yeah, so my watermelon chapter is definitely my darkest chapter. It was the most depressing chapter to write, just because I can chronicle the visual history of the watermelon as this terrible racial trope for such a long time throughout American history. And there are so many examples of how image makers and artists used watermelon to portray this really nasty stereotype that African American people have this insatiable lust for the fruit, like they are drooling over the fruit, stealing the fruit. So it perpetuates this really horrific stereotype. And a lot of scholars have located that stereotype in the 20th century, but it happens way before then. It happens around the Reconstruction period and the Jim Crow era, when African American people have gained more rights as citizens. And what these images are designed to do is to show them as not good citizens, right? To show them as savage, as animalistic, not even as human, as a way to try to advocate for taking away those rights. And so, you know, I had a lot of ethical dilemma in reproducing some of those images in my chapter. And I'm curious what you think about that in terms of like, what do you do in the classroom when you have really miserable images that confront, you know, ugly histories? I don't want to perpetuate those stereotypes, obviously. I want to confront them, but I also am sensitive to how maybe my readers of color might feel upon seeing these images. Like, do you have to straddle that boundary in your own research?
Yes, I actually the very first class I taught at University of New Mexico, my thesis project was in the Inquisition. So I have all these images of violence in relation to the Inquisition in Mexico and violence against Native Americans of Central Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how, but the way I thought it was very offensive to one of my Native kids.
Wow.
And she came forward and confronted me. She goes, I think it's disgusting that you romanticize.
Oh my
And
goodness.
I never did that. However, it made me rethink of the ways in which I teach this material, because because it's such sensitive material with good reason, and it's loaded with so much violent history. And that's the thing, like all the images that I show in my class in relation to the colonial period, they're violent. Any image of the Virgen de Guadalupe, right, with this in the background, like there's a violent history behind it. But there's certain images that superficially look a lot more violent than ideologically, right? Or they're both equally charged. And some images don't look like that to our eyes. So it made me rethink of the ways in which I approach this material. So ever since then, from day one to the last day, I remind my students, one, that everything related to the colonial period, regardless of how beautiful it might look to our eyes, it's charged with this fucked up violence and ideological, you know, weight. So I think that doing this throughout the course allows my students to see that if I arrive to an image that it's visually just like strikingly violent, allows them to see that I am not romanticizing, you know, but it's a lot of labor.
Right. So that's also what I teach too, that a lot of the most racist images you can interpret as being like hauntingly beautiful, right? That's how they seduce you. That's how the danger of these racist images is that they use visual techniques of like beauty and seduction to try to make that claim seem real, to try to naturalize those stereotypes. And so I feel like I can't not confront these watermelon images. We need to be educated about them. I'm surprised by how many people don't know about the watermelon trope, and it hasn't died. Like it keeps reoccurring as more people of color come into power. Like it had a resurgence with Obama. I'm now seeing a resurgence in watermelon racist imagery with Kamala Harris in office. Like it's going away. So we have to know its history to be able to try to exterminate it.
And that's the thing. Speaking of Kirsten, I think that's the difference. Like we understand that, right? Like she talks about how like we understand that these things are wrong, that these things are racist, but going to the core of that, even though it shouldn't be the labor of people because, you know, because life and because of a lot of things, I think it's worth into exploring some of these ideas. And I really do think that starting through the visual culture to the history of art will allow you to understand this in an easier way than going directly into some like heavy theory,
Right.
like this.
Because, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think also our students are more prepared to deal with visual images than any generation before.
Yes, yes.
We have Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, billboards that are, everywhere in terms of like how we use visual platforms. And so they are a uniquely visual generation. And so it's a great entry point to understanding how systems of power work, because they know that visual images can be deceitful, that they are manipulated, they are crafted very carefully by those who produce them. And so it's not even that mind-blowing for them to understand that these visual images were concocted and manufactured. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And and that's the thing about teaching today. This is why sometimes I teach and then I insert a video and then PowerPoint. It's just, you have to be managing images in such a frantic way. Yeah. And that sticks to the new generations, because that's exactly how they consume them in Instagram. Speaking of, let's go back to that idea that you brought in the beginning of the interview. I look at some of these still lifes, and then you mentioned our obsession with picturing everything that we eat. What kind of relation do you see right there?
In terms of what it means for us today, or
or both, like what it meant to have a fancy still life in the late 1800s or early 19 in the early 1800s, late 1700s, versus like flexing on Instagram, like the delicious dish that you just ate.
Yeah, I mean, it was like a visual flex in the 19th century. If you had a beautiful still life painting in your dining room that showed the most mouth-watering, delicious fruits, that was a testament to your affluence, right? That was a symbol of your power, your kind of economic wealth. But it's funny because I also have read a lot of etiquette manuals from the time period, and a lot of these authors say, don't get a still life that looks too delicious, because then when people come over and eat with you in your dining room, you don't want them to be envious of the still life painting, wishing that they could eat the foods in the painting more so than the foods that you've prepared on your table.
Oh, wow.
I know, isn't that hilarious? It's like, you don't want your pictures to look too mouth-watering. It has to be this fine balance of being a symbol of status and wealth without outshining what you've actually made for your friends and family.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting. It's so ridiculous at the same time.
I mean, also what I love about the Victorian period is that that's when you have these individualized silverware utensils that come out, like everything that you can think of, from a specialized watermelon knife to an ice cream spoon to a banana pedestal. Like all of these individual utensils come out in the late 19th century as Americans are starting to make more of a ritual around the consumption of food. And like really kind of cool artifacts from that time period.
That's fascinating. I wondered if you can send me some of those photographs and maybe we can post them either in Patreon or something, so people, so some of our viewers can see them.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit, and this is maybe self-serving, but I don't care. This is my podcast. I can do whatever the fuck I want. I've been thinking on captivity narratives of the 19th century, this paranoia of Native American culture and how it's going to get your women and it's going to get your children. And I tie it to like earlier in the 18th century in Mexico and those martyr portraits that you've seen that I talk about, and then later with Westerns, et cetera, et cetera. But I wondered a little if you can tell me a little bit more about the Homestead Act, the idea of manifest destiny moving towards the West, because that history is contingent to this new territory the United States just gained with the Mexican-American War. But how does food play in the expansion, in the promotion of the West, but also in the disavowing of Native Americans and also Mexicans?
Yeah, so food is so immersed in rhetoric about the Western frontier. I mean, it's almost like obvious. It's so textbook. So think of like images of the 1800s when you have heroicized pioneers like Daniel Boone, you know, pointing their finger to the landscape that they want to conquer. That stuff enters into representations of food too, like we talked about with the grape. The idea that when you cultivate a piece of land, when you plant something on that land, you claim it as your own, and you're modifying that landscape and profiting off it for yourself. And so there's all this rhetoric, narratives, and manuals and books and paintings and artworks that are suggesting that one way to take advantage of this landscape that was supposedly divinely bestowed upon white American people was to plant on it, was to make on it. And so representations of food look so much like landscape paintings of manifest destiny that created this idea that white Americans were divinely entitled to what was indigenous land.
And it's so interesting because you do talk about how it divinely entitled to cultivate food, desecrate a piece of land that was sacred to Native Americans for you know, in a lot of examples.
And like, to even go beyond that, not everyone was divinely bestowed this land, because the people who actually made the food on that landscape were not accepted as citizens. And so the grape is another example of that. Also the Hawaiian pineapple. There was a lot of anxieties about the Asian immigrants and the African-American people, as well as indigenous Hawaiians who were harvesting a lot of our tropical fruits. White Americans expressed a lot of anxiety, saying that we don't want people of color making our fruit. Like, they shouldn't have the privilege to cultivate America's fruit lands. And so at the same time, they wanted to incorporate the landscape. A lot of them didn't want to incorporate the people who were toiling that landscape.
Wow.
Yeah.
One way or another, it's all contaminated. Let's talk a little bit about the pineapple. It's fascinating. I use the pineapple in my class, but to illustrate much earlier history. Okay. In the 16th centuries, you have the first, you know, Spanish, I don't know why we call them conquistadors. Like, they're not conquering anything. You know, it's not a romantic narrative. It's so stupid. When you have the first 16th century invaders, they are looking at everything they've never seen before. There's one chronicler, his name is Fernández de Oviedo, and his chronicles, nobody paid attention to them because he didn't know how to draw in the style of the Renaissance, naturalistically. He was like a bad artist. Sure. So he will have an image of a fruit and then talk about what it was. And it's very interesting because in his diary, he spent like 5 pages talking about the pineapple. In regards to the thistle, it looks like this, but it's not that. It might be an artichoke, but it doesn't really taste like an artichoke. 5 pages, girl. Yeah, 5 pages trying to describe. So I always use that example to talk about if the Spanish were not capable of describing something as simple as like a different fruit, imagine understanding the more complex ideas of Aztec religion. Not to give them the benefit of the doubt, but just to add another layer, to nuance with another layer of how the encounter, you know, again, also a term that I'm starting to not use as much, how the encounter is contingent to all of that, not only to the difference and the color of the skin of the people they encounter, but the different clothing and the different territories and the different foods. And that's just in the 16th century. But I know that throughout, since that point, since Oviedo, the pineapple became the symbol of status. And it's like, it has its own history.
Yeah, so in your time period, I would imagine botanical engravings are also a good example for examining that history. Botanical engravings are so rooted in a history of empire. Like you're describing, you have these amateur artists who are sketching the pineapple or fruits that they've never seen before. And they even show the fruit sliced in half to give European viewers back home the sense of what the fruit looked like on the inside. And to be able to describe not just what it looked like, but the taste would obviously be very challenging. I mean, we tell our students, it's really hard to describe what you see, but imagine trying to describe what you taste. Like, you have to use a point of reference. And so the apple might have been that comparable point of reference for understanding what a pineapple tasted like. Pineapple is like one of the most imperial fruits. I mean, it has always represented empire. And even the shape of the pineapple, right? It has a crown. So it is like by nature a kind of food that lends itself to status and power and royalty. What is really crazy that happens in the 20th century is that there becomes this burgeoning and successful pineapple business in Hawaii. But the pineapple is not indigenous to Hawaii. That really surprises a lot of my students and readers, because we think of it as so synonymous with tropical Hawaii, but that was imported from South America.
Right.
And it also shows you how visual images can make something seem so natural and can make the fruit seem indigenous to a place like Hawaii when it was not at all.
That's what Kirsten always talks about it in terms of landscape, that we take landscape as a given, that it's so naturalized that it looks boring to us and we ignore it.
Right.
Yeah, and fruit is the same, and like food is the same thing.
Yeah.
That we don't even think about it. We're like, yes, of course, like Hawaii, pineapples. When we went to Hawaii, we went and we saw an incredible exhibition, and I think we told you about. And this was like in early 2019 at the Bishop Museum.
Oh,
and
yeah,
it was I mean, I know you hate that word, but it was the wokest exhibition I've seen in my life. Like it was, you will have the visual culture of pineapple in Hawaii, but every single label was divided in two, a white label and a black label.
Awesome.
The white label will say the pineapple is a symbol of the economic prosperity of Hawaii, and it will be like a traveling magazine from the early 20th century, right? And then the black label will be like, by the way, did you know that the pineapple is not even from Hawaii? Like, why are you out drinking this like pineapple Kool-Aid? Like,
totally.
It was amazing.
I have a million things to say, because first of all, some of the best scholarship right now is coming out of Hawaii. Like, forget about your of the world. Like, the most like powerful and scholarship of resistance, in my opinion, is coming out of Hawaii.
Yes.
The second thing I want to say is that you're right. Like, we look at a landscape image and it seems so boring and it seems so straightforward, but we have to constantly unlearn, right? The process of unlearning what we see and what we know. And so much of my book is trying to expose how representations of food are not so innocent. They're not so innocuous as they seem, but also that we have to read what has been written outside of the picture plane. That we can't just look at what is being visualized, but we always have to look at who is being omitted, who is being obscured, what kind of histories are being glossed over in these images, because what is not pictured is just as important as what is pictured.
Right, and I think I think about, and coming back to the pineapple and what you're saying of what's been omitted, there's such a scientific weight to the pineapple, because ever since the 16th century, and then with the advent of the Enlightenment and scientific re-exploration into the Americas, there was this, there's all these treatises that talk about weather, right? Peoples in warm weather were not allowed to think as people in cold weather.
Right.
So now, like, I'm just making these connections right now. The food, something like the pineapple must have been an example, like this wild fruit must have been an example of something that is sensual, but like it's at the same time it's vacuous, right? Like, I don't know, like I'm thinking about the way that the way that native peoples from the late 1500s to this day have been disregarded in relation to weather, and now I'm thinking about food.
So that's described as climate theory. I deal with that a lot in my book, because with something like the banana, for instance, I mean, there are so many racist discussions and descriptions of how people in the tropics eat the banana, that they are part of these equatorial climates in which they are so lazy, all they have to do is pluck the fruit off the tree and eat it. There's no sophistication to people in the tropics.
Right.
And the people being closer to the equator were thought to be less sophisticated, less intelligent. And then that's why I think a lot of Americans in the United States around the same time period, they're trying to distance themselves from how people in the tropics eat the banana. So they create all these new silverware tools and all of these new decorative objects in order to eat the banana and cook the banana, and not just to eat it raw in a quote lazy fashion. It's really just a way of distancing themselves from how people of cultures outside their own eat it.
You know, we read this essay on on the picturesque and traveling in the picturesque is Mexico by Persephone. I'm missing the last name, but she talks about how trauma functions in terms of traveling. You have a perceived idea about, let's say, Mexico, like this exotic and fantasy about Mexico. And when you travel, the governments of the places where you travel from and the government of the places where you go feed into this fantasy. So they create maps to guide you through, let's say, through areas of Mexico City where you fulfill your Frida fantasy or your Aztec fantasy or whatever, right? But the second you cross that threshold, the second you go to a quote unquote not so safe neighborhood and something may happen to you, which will end up in CNN and Fox News, you know, that when you cross that threshold, the sensuality, the attractiveness of that fantasy becomes trauma. And it's so interesting that you talk about food, because food it gives us these preconceived ideas. And I always think about Hawaii, because you go with this tropical fantasy pineapple thing about Hawaii, you arrive to Hawaii and then you see all these independent movements, all these like native Hawaiians were like, fuck you tourists. So like you cross a threshold from fantasy to trauma. And but the vehicle that in a way, it's a nice liminal safe space between both, between the fantasy, the anxiety, it's the food.
Yeah, Emma, that is so brilliant. Like the way you just described that, because you're right. Food is at that threshold that you're describing, because it is something that is tasty looking, delicious. It's something that's attractive. It can allow people to experience another culture without having to, be a part of that culture, I guess. At the same time, there's also this idea of you are what you eat. That since the colonial period, people in the United States have this idea that what you eat will transform you, both your racial composition, your moral character, that in the 1800s, it was dangerous to eat certain foods because they didn't want to turn into, say, like slow, lazy Native Americans, according to those stereotypes. They didn't turn into the people who were eating those foods because, food was so entangled in racist attitudes. And so like you're saying, it's at that threshold. It can allow people to experience other cultures, but not too deep into that culture. A lot of people didn't want to, sink into that culture too much by actually consuming the foods in a kind of physical way, consuming that culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like the difference between eating it and being it,
Yeah, that is totally brilliant. The difference between eating it and being it, exactly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because now, like, after reading your book, and I'm changing my syllabus now because we have a seminar on encounters, and I never thought about food as a mediator for encounters. Or like a pre-encounter encounter, right? And again, now understanding encounter as like this uneven exchange of power, but it's so fascinating because I really never, again, because it's such a given, because we didn't think about it, because we just in the podcast. Just one last thought. We have been talking a lot about food, but it's always in relation to expectations of authenticity. And this idea that you have, as this modern US person, you have an idea of what a Mexican taco should look and taste like, right? Because you saw it in TV, because you grew up with it, because of the stereotypes, because of everything. And the second you eat it and doesn't fulfill that fantasy of your own fantasies, it doesn't authenticate you, then you keep looking and then you label something as not authentic, Yeah. And so like every time I see the word authentic in Mexican restaurants or anywhere, authentic Indian food or authentic this, I'm always like lights.
Right. Kirsten has always attuned us to the difficulties of that word, right? Like the speciality that comes with the word authenticity. But tell me what you think of this example that I heard recently on NPR. They were talking about how a lot of senators, create legislation and they leave the Capitol building, they'll go to like these two favorite haunts. One is a Mexican food joint and another is a falafel place. So isn't it interesting that some of these senators, they are doing that point of contact, right? They're having that encounter like you're describing. They're eating falafel, they're eating Middle Eastern food, they're eating Mexican food, yet they're also creating legislation that totally disempowers and discriminates against the people whose food that belongs to or was invented by, you know? And so food only goes so far, right? It can be this point of contact, but it only goes so far as to actually change minds or change attitudes. That as much as it can celebrate a culture and can bring people together, it can also, you know, not be so helpful.
Right. Ooh.
We talked a lot.
I feel like we're just getting started. But before we go, like, I know you have to go, like, before we go, I want you to tell me a little bit of what's next. I know, like, this book has been in the works for years, right? And you're probably not thinking about your next project, but I wondered if you're working on something new, and also tell us where we can find you, the social media, all of that stuff.
Okay, well, really quickly about this current book, I just want people to know that I'm not making a cent from the book. All of the royalties are being donated to the Coalition of Immokalee Farm Workers. It's this amazing civil rights organization that helps to ensure better wages for our farm workers and to ensure that the conditions are okay, and, you know, to fight for people who are experiencing abuses on our fields. So that is where all of the money is going. My book is an academic book in some ways, so that it's priced like one. Unfortunately, it's a little bit expensive. So I'd love to offer anyone a discount code to be able to make it more affordable. So I can give you that discount code. In terms of what I'm thinking about in the future, I still want to stay in the arena of food studies. I really like this niche that I found with combining art and food. And so the next project I'm going to tackle is milk.
Oh, yes, I was going to ask you about milk.
Yeah, because you know it's not just any milk, it's breast milk, which is strange and quirky. But I'm telling you, I really think I'm onto something, because there are these really strange photographs from the Victorian period of women facing the camera while they're breastfeeding. And in the Victorian period, when it was impolite to even show your elbows or your ankles, right? You're so buttoned up in American Victorian culture. You know, why are women bearing their breasts? Why are they breastfeeding for the camera? I'm really interested in ideas about whiteness and milk and motherhood. And so if anyone has any feedback or images, do send them my way. I think this will be my next project.
Yes, I think, oh, you can take that back, because in Catholic, in Christianity,
right.
I look into this, and I need another lifetime to do this project. But there is a relationship between the Dominicans, this religious group, and the Franciscans. The Franciscans attach themselves to the blood of Christ. So the Dominicans come out with the iconography of the milk of Mary.
Right.
Yeah. So they have this
competition. About this.
Yeah, they have this competition. And recently there's been a band. Their name is Kings of Leon. And the dad of the singer, it has ties with the KKK. In the last album, you see all of their faces emerging from milk.
No. Oh my God, that is so fucked up. Yeah, I remember we've talked about this before, and you pointed me to some images that are like so wild for maybe American eyes today. It's literally like the Madonna and Child, but the Madonna has like milk spraying out into the viewer. I mean, it's so straightforward. It would never happen in American culture because we're so mechanical, but you're right. Like there's definitely a longer European history that Americans are borrowing from in terms of the religious iconography behind milk.
And that's a thing, like, that's one of the things that I'm exploring, that the definitions of American as an empire, in so many ways, they're rooted to to Spain, like the Iberian Peninsula as empire. Like, I always want to blame the Spanish for absolutely everything, right? For all the shit in the world.
Right. So they were responsible for a lot of it.
So I'm always attaching them to this fucked up history. Okay, so tell us where everybody can find you.
Yeah, people can find me on Instagram. I have an account called The Fruits of Empire. And around once a week, I post an image of a food and art, and I explain it, or I offer an interpretation. You can also just Google me. I have an academic profile page that's linked with Penn State University. I'm going to be giving a talk at Washington University in St. Louis in March. I have some other virtual talks coming up, and I've done a few podcast interviews now, but this by far was my favorite and the most, can't wait to broadcast it.
Well, Shana, my love, I am so happy we got to do this. I don't know, like just thinking about some of those days in the classroom with Kirsten, and then the second I got your book, I wanted to cry. I was so happy. I will be violently promote you everywhere I can.
So
I really hope, and I'm gonna show the image again for like those who get to see the Zoom recording. The Fruits of Empire, Art, Food, and the Politics of Race in the Age of American Expansion by Shana Klein. Google it, loca. It's everywhere. Thank you so much for this amazing interview. And yes, and we'll hopefully this should end soon so you can come to Mexico, or we can go over there or something.
Thanks for your support, Emma. I love you.
I love you too.
That's us. Bye.
Bye.